I'm Rachel Riley, and you're listening to the Power of Us podcast, brought to you by Legal & General. Today we're rethinking retirement. What can we do to be better prepared for our individual and collective futures? Introducing our panel today, we have Claire Turner from the Centre for Ageing Better. Hi, Claire.
Hi.
We have Zoe Adams, an Age UK phone volunteer. Welcome, Zoe.
Hello.
And our third panellist is Eugene Marchese from Guild Living. Hi, Eugene.
Good morning.
We're here today to discuss rethinking retirement. As individuals, how do you want to live when you're a senior citizen? I'll start with Claire.
From my perspective, I think I'll want many of the things that I want now out of life. We did some research with people asking them what they thought made a good later life. And it was all the things that make life worth living now, isn't it? Having enough money, having good health, having connections, having a meaning and purpose, something to do.
Zoe, have you got anything to add to that list?
Yes, and this may sound hopefully not too bleak, but I don't want to feel kind of invisible or afraid, which I feel can sometimes be the case with senior citizens. Maybe that's just my experiences with my lovely Age UK friend. But I want to still feel seen, and also, as Claire said, purpose, I think, is really important.
And Zoe, as an Age UK phone volunteer, you've straight away kind of gone for things that you don't want to feel as an older person. Is that because that's what people are calling you to speak about?
Yes, exactly. My friend Alan, he is absolutely wonderful. He calls me his soul buddy because we're very, very similar, even though we're, I think, like 56 years apart. And he really, really struggles with technology, which completely cuts him off from society. And when I speak to him, he's like, oh, I'm really struggling. So I see these micro moments, these small things, which they incrementally build up. And if we can address those, then I think it would make such a difference.
That's really interesting. And in a lot of ways, older people just want the same as everybody wants in life. But in other ways, they're completely out of sync, possibly, with technology. Eugene, do you think there's a box of people, senior citizens, that are just different from younger people? How do you see it?
Look, I concur with the ladies that there is a blend of fear and optimism, that there is definitely a grouping of older people that is the loneliness and isolation is what's driving that segregation in the older community. You know, how do I stay connected? You know, who can I speak to about anything? I've been doing some befriending calls with Age UK as well, and it's just so clear that it's that lack of interaction that's driving that fear. And then, you know, all they've got is the TV in front of them. And if you think about current events, all they're being fed is, doomsday, doomsday, doomsday. You know, the pandemic is one thing, you know, the current pandemic, but the deeper pandemic is that isolation and loneliness.
And I guess there's two ways to kind of approach that problem. You can either connect with people on the phone or in person, but obviously with the pandemic, there's, you know, more challenges in that respect, or there's getting the older generation more computer literate. What's the best approach?
It's got to be firstly approached from a policy level. And if you think about the money that governments around the globe have spent now on trying to solve this issue, and you think about the number of people that have either passed or been impacted by not just the COVID-19, but impacted by the loneliness, depression and isolation that's brought on, and the impact that's had on the economy. This is not something we can set aside and think it's all going to go away, like, you know, with a vaccine.
Yeah. And Zoe, are you finding an increased number of phone calls, particularly about isolation and loneliness?
Yes, I started speaking to Alan in July, but actually he said he's not feeling the effects of lockdown because he's been alone for so long, which is absolutely heartbreaking. But the thing is, he's got such a positive outlook because he thinks you're kind of bombarded with all the bad news. And he counts himself lucky because he's like, got my pension and I've got my flat. But that, I think, actually just shows how much of an issue it is. I think it's more that he used to be able to go to the library, and that would mean that he's simply around people. He's not even interacting with them. He would just like to get the bus to be around people. But now I'm helping him, and you know, it's wonderful to be able to have that impact. But I feel like everyone should be able to have that kind of at their fingertips.
Claire, are you finding similar things from your end?
Sometimes when we think about people in later life, we can lump people together. They can see this as a generation of people that have never had it so good. But I think it's really, really important to think that that this group of people is really diverse, and there were huge inequalities for people in later life in the UK today. 1.3 million people, this age group, living in poverty. COVID-19 has just exacerbated those inequalities. We did some work with Ipsos Mori recently, talking to people in their 50s and their 60s. 1 in 5 people were saying their physical health had deteriorated. Over a third were saying their mental health had got worse. So I think it's really important, but I think there is a real risk that we do lump people together. Being older is 50 plus, and that's potentially a group of people aged 50 to 100. We wouldn't do that in the reverse. We wouldn't put 0 to 50-year-olds together in a group. It would be strange.
The topic of today is rethinking retirement, but is there even any such thing as retirement anymore, Eugene?
The notion that you hit 55 and then it got sort of moved to 60 and you retire is so antiquated. My co-founder at Guild Living is 65 and Michael has just moved up from Sydney 3 years ago and is CEO of a business that's about to, change the way that older people live. And looking beyond the baby boomer, definitely the Gen Xers and every other cohort that's coming behind them is not thinking that there is an age limit to my life. We need to change the narrative in society. And I heard terms like God's waiting room and all these sort of things in a number of the focus groups that we've run in the last few months. Imagine if we tapped into that knowledge base. Businesses could really benefit from ex-CEOs who have been running corporations, or carpenters or gardeners or chefs. And yet we don't tap into that resource. I think the benefits will be huge for everybody. If you look at the Japanese culture, they actually don't have a word for retirement in their vocabulary. They use the word ikigai. And ikigai means purely having a sense of purpose, having a reason to get up every morning. And so you've got people who in Japan who reach that third age and reinvent themselves.
You mentioned Japan, and stereotypically you think of Japanese culture as revering older people. So do you think it's a Western thing that we have this societal ageism problem?
Look, I've travelled the world touring care facilities, and I can tell you it's a scourge of our modern society. And this notion that the Chinese or say Italians, Spaniards, look after their parents better because it's a cultural thing, it's not true. The reality is that modern society has compressed time, has made us all way too busy, and it's a reason why we don't connect with our parents or older loved ones, because we just don't have that time. So it's a common theme across the globe, and it's something that we all need as a society to change, because it is the reason why loneliness is burning through our older generation.
Would you agree with that, Claire? Do you think the lack of value that we place in older people is a side effect of modern fast living?
Age is really pervasive in our society in the UK. 1 in 3 people in the UK report experiencing some kind of age prejudice. It can become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that you can hear older people, having a sort of certain view of themselves or their capabilities based on the ageism they see. So it's not necessarily that older people are being insulted or abused in the street, but it is very much this indirect, benign indifference. And I think often this kind of high warmth, low competence, this idea that older people are kind of doddery but dear, this kind of patronising way in which we often think about people in later life. We're back to that issue, aren't we, of these kind of stereotypes.
And interestingly, that topic of conversation has come up quite a lot with the presidential election in the US, I've noticed. Even compared to no spring chicken Donald Trump, Joe Biden seems to have his age referenced far more. I've had people asking, is he too old? Is his health going to deteriorate to be president? Things like that. Where do people draw the line?
Often in stereotypes, there can be a kernel of truth. People in later life, their health can deteriorate. And I do believe that if people were making kind of racist or sexist remarks, that they would be called out. Think about, you go to buy a card for somebody who is coming up to their 60th, 70th, 80th birthday. It's all jokes, isn't it? But we know that ageism does have a negative impact. I mean, even to think about older people in the workplace, examples of people feeling discriminated against on the basis of age, that stuff is serious.
And Zoe, since you started speaking to Alan, have you found that you notice the ageism more?
It's almost like it's an acceptable prejudice. But funnily enough, when I speak to Alan, we're so similar that sometimes I don't notice the age at all. I think as well, he actually sees himself as very young. So he's 86, but in the morning he does his Pilates, he gets on his easy rider bike. He said the other day that he tried to run for the bus and he got annoyed because he couldn't. Also, I think, as Claire said, we need to honour the diversity of people, because there are so many amazing stories within each individual. Alan was telling me how he was a bandsman in the army, and there were such fascinating stories. And I think, God, all of that, no one's hearing it. And imagine if they could tell their stories, that would be phenomenal. But no, funnily enough, I don't actually notice the difference. With technology, it highlights the gap. So I was teaching him how to go onto the internet, and he said, oh, there's a flashing vertical line. And I was like, oh, that's the cursor. And he was like, oh, what's the cursor? And I was like, oh, God, that's when I notice it. But in terms of essence and who we are, I don't see it.
How do we get society to view people? Do you think media has a role with how they project older people?
So if you think about the one asset that older people have got, and Zoe touched on it really beautifully, is history and stories. We run a program at Guild called the Extraordinary Lives Project, and what we're doing is inviting people in local areas to just come and tell us their story. Some of the stories that we're hearing from people who say, look, I think I've got a good, interesting story. I'm not sure if anyone would be interested in hearing this. And then you hear stories of people a lady who went for a job interview during the Second World War with a gentleman's family who she thought she was going to be a housekeeper. And when the gentleman interviewed her, realised this was an extraordinary lady, brought her down to, headquarters in central London. And 6 months later, they've got her parachuting behind enemy lines in the south of Italy. It's not the media's job to do anything. It's our job as a society to change the way we approach all of this and understand that there is a richness of history that will be lost forever if we don't sit there and extract it out of them.
What you just said really, struck resonance with me in terms of Holocaust education, because people like the Holocaust Education Trust get survivors to go in and talk to school children, and the little children will ask questions and get pieces of information out of the older people that you just wouldn't hear otherwise. But is there enough, just regular people going and talking to children?
I'm not such an advocate of this idea of linking older people with children, because I think it runs much deeper than that, and that feels quite contrived. The language and the images that we use are really, really important. We did some analysis of the language and imagery used by lots of different, from government to the media. Even the government most often talks about our ageing population as a burden, or it talks about this in the language in terms of crisis or tsunami, all these kind of words at times in the media, where that often there is a really good and an important story about aging, but the photograph that accompanies it is a pair of wrinkly hands. The content of the story is important and it's good, but the imagery is still back to this idea. And what we get in advertising is, a sort of sad looking person in a high back chair looking lonely, or we get a kind of skydiving granny doing kind of crazy stunts. And I think there's a whole gap in the middle of what real life is actually like. And I think that I agree with you, Jean, that it's a kind of role for all of us in terms of, how we present aging as an opportunity.
Do you think older people and their advocates, are they too quiet?
It's just become acceptable. You get this morphing from one cultural norm to another without actually even realising it. And we almost ignore it because it makes us uncomfortable to confront it. And I think we do need a rethink.
What are the economic benefits of supporting senior citizens? It sounds like a stupid question.
Well, you only have to look at the impact on the NHS budget, adult social care in local communities, all the way through to GPs who have waiting rooms full of older people who just want to come in and have a conversation.
And you often hear about older people in terms of being a drain on resources. Claire, I'll bring you in.
That there are lots of people in their 50s and 60s still in the labour market, working, contributing financially in that way. I don't think we always quantify the contribution that older people make in other ways. So, for example, you think about informal care. We know that people in later life are more likely to be carers than any other kind of life stage. I think it's a time for us to think about differently about how we weigh up these costs and benefits.
And Zoe, in terms of, Alan, who you speak to, what would his life be like if you weren't speaking to him? Who was he talking to before?
He has one friend, and And that's it. So no one really. I mean, I spoke to him a few weeks ago, and like, God love him, he was like, oh, I'm so excited to speak to you. He used to go to dancing lessons, but even then he would say you would turn up, you would dance, and then you'd go home. So for him, he would, alleviate it by going to the library and reading the newspaper there, or, as I said, going out for the day where he'd have a sandwich in a cafe or something, or getting the bus, but there's no connection there.
And do you think it's right that it relies on the goodness of your heart as a volunteer in the charitable sector to actually give him some sense of connection with someone?
No, I don't think it should have to be that way at all. But I am honoured that I do have that role. Touching on what Claire and Eugene have both said, in terms of changing the kind of associations we have in memory, and when you think of, an elderly person, what comes to mind? You think, okay, care home, nursing home, and no doubt the 5 top words I would ask you none of them would include kind of positive attributes really at all. And this is where I guess the whole unconscious bias and implicit attitude stuff comes in. But for a seismic shift, we need to start building new associations, and that will then lead to something bigger where it becomes a part of our culture, not to be individualistic and be like, oh, well, I'm going out tonight, so I can't speak to anyone.
It does seem like a consistent theme between the three of you that we need some kind of revolution to promote positivity around the ageing process so we can see older people have value. Do you think companies should be using their advertising revenue to show them in a positive light?
Most of the wealth around the globe in Western society sits with the baby boomer generation, and a lot of that is tied up in housing. And if you have a look at the whole idea of how will an older person look after themselves, and you compare the UK to countries like New Zealand, Australia, where you use your equity in your home to pay for your care, whereas the UK is pretty much predominantly under the NHS system, I think there needs to be responsibility taken by the older generation to understand that they need to fund that. What COVID has done is it's really brought that to the fore, that the current care home system in the UK is broken. And this is not disparaging anyone that works in the care home industry, because they are amazing human beings, but the system is broken. And so the grey pound really comes into that discussion. Who's going to look after me when I'm 75 and I'll have issues, and not expect the government to pay for everything, because that isn't going to be possible.
Zoe and Claire, do you agree with that? Do you think it should be the individual's responsibility to pay for their own care when they're older? And
I don't know if it's down to that whole individualistic versus collectivist, because obviously if it was individualistic, I'd think, well, no, I'm responsible for me. But I think if we were more collectivist, that would just make such a difference. Maybe it's a blend of both. But I know for sure, I think Alan is very independent. Maybe he's learned that he can't rely on anyone, so he's had to rely on himself.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to be really clear, I'm not advocating that everyone pays for we obviously need a safety net for those who can't. But for those who can, absolutely they should be.
Do you think taxation is set up in the way that best incentivises people to sell their properties now to pay for their own care, or does something need to change?
What has been demonstrated in Australia and New Zealand is by removing that stamp duty, people are incentivised to make that move. And what it does is it releases family homes that, maybe 1 or 2 people are sitting in a 3 or 4 bedroom home, which is better suited to a younger family. So looking at that whole tax regime, what is stopping older people looking to move out of a home that no longer suits them? This is often not being raised by the individual who wants to move. It's the children sitting there around a kitchen table saying, Mum, Dad, that's half my inheritance going into that.
I found it the other way. I felt my parents and grandparents are looking and saying, we want to leave you something, and children actually saying, we want you to live your life. We want you to, enjoy the money that you've earned.
I mean, we only need to look at successive governments kicking that issue into the long grass to realise how complex it is. So there's a number of reasons why you stay somewhere that might not be perfect for you in terms of accessibility, for example. That if that's your family home in an area where you've got friends. But I think some of the barriers are really, that actually what is there to move into? If you own your 3-bed council house in Barnsley, you can't afford a bungalow. Some of these things are really like practical financial decisions.
Is there enough choice in terms of where people want to live and where they can live?
No, I don't think there is. There are ways in which, if we are building new homes today, where we can think about, could they be fit for an ageing population? If we were to think more about the design of our homes being fit for people as they age, That's a much more interesting proposition in terms of being able to keep older people being able to stay in the communities they want, near the amenities.
So is this something the government should be focused on? That they should be incentivising the private sector to build a variety of safe places for older people to live?
Economics drives behaviour in the private sector. If you can demonstrate that there is a profit, and we know that property sector is going to be in hurt for a long time with what's happening at the moment. So if the government can introduce, and it doesn't have to be incentives, it just needs to be the right policy, but the responsibility lies with people like us at Guild to come up with a solution. But generally, you'd have to say that the current offering is not good enough to extract people out of the family home.
When do you think we should start thinking about ourselves in terms of when we get older and how we want to live our lives, Zoe?
So I changed jobs recently and I got a pension thing through. I mean, that shows how much I've thought about it. I got a pension thing. Doesn't bode well. But then I think it was maybe last year, I was thinking, gosh, it's something I've really got to start to think about.
And Claire, do you think we need to talk about our own ageing a bit more?
Absolutely. When people they think it's not going to happen to me, we associate aging with dying. And so we don't want to think about it. But I think it's difficult. I mean, I'm in my 40s, and I've started to initiate conversation with my friends because of the job that I do. But I think this phase of life has got so many immediate pressures with the children and all of those things that actually it is very, very difficult for us as human beings to think about the future. But actually, there are other issues about where we want to live, what we want to do with the rest of our lives that I think is really, really important for us to have more ongoing conversations, just to dispel some of those fears, really. We did some work recently where we were providing what's called midlife support, so giving an opportunity for people to come together and to think about the rest of their lives. And people in that room were saying to us, God, nobody's asked me since I was at school.
We've come to the kind of group conclusion that we need a societal change. We need ageism to be in the same level of toxicity as sexism and racism. And we need to identify these things individually or as media or as companies. So I just, if you just said one thing each that you could change, what would that be? Start with Claire.
So I think, championing the real story of aging, to sort of demystify it all and to normalise it. I mean, that would be the ultimate for me.
Eugene?
I think if we approached it the same way as we approach mental health, the fact that men now confront it, and it was a taboo subject for many, many years, I think we need to attack the whole way we approach ageism, and I think that's the starting point. If we talk about it, then all of a sudden you flush it out.
Although that's a great positive point to finish on. And Zoe, the last word from you or possibly from the words of Alan.
I would love to go up to every senior citizen and just tell them that they're worthy. They are worthy and they are seen and they are valuable. That would be what I would love, for them to feel that, to really internalise that.
A little bit more kindness doesn't cost anything.
Yes, exactly.
You've been listening to the Power of Us podcast, hosted by me, Rachel Riley, and brought to you by Legal and General. Next week's podcast looks at future-proofing society. Now more than ever, how can we give our communities the best chance possible?